speaker to join us this last week. Professor Gary Mormino is the Frankie Duckwall Professor Emeritus in Florida History at the University of South Florida in St. Pete. He presently holds a position of Scholar in Residence at the Florida Humanities Council. His PhD is in History from the University of North Carolina, and he taught at the University of South Florida from 1977 to 2015. His books include The Immigrant World of Ybor City, Italians and Their Latin Neighbors, required reading for this institute, which he co-authored with George Poseta, which was awarded also the Theodore Salutus Prize for the best book in immigration history. He also wrote Land of Sunshine, State of Dreams, A Social History of Florida, which received the Charlton to Go Prize for the best book in Florida history. In 2007, PBS and WDU adapted the book into a documentary, The Florida Dream, which was awarded a regional Emmy. He is also the author of two other volumes, Immigrants on the Hill, Italians in St. Louis, which was awarded the Howard Morado Prize for the best book in Italian history, and Spanish Pathways in Florida, 1492 to 1992. Dr. Mormino has received numerous awards and accolades for his work on Florida history, including being honored with the Distinguished Author Award by the Florida House of Representatives in 2012 and the 2015 Florida Lifetime Achievement Award in Writing. He's presently working on a study of Florida 2000 to 2012, a monograph on Florida, he's presently working on a study of Florida, a monograph on Florida in World War II, a biography of Millard Caldwell, and a history of Florida foodways. It's a great honor to welcome Dr. Gary Mormino.
Just delighted to be here. Had the pleasure of being in Spain most of the summer. So I just got back. I would have loved to have participated in the early sessions, but I love talking about Ybor City. Best thing that ever happened to me was moving to Tampa, Florida, just about 42 years ago this month. I remember waiting for my family, so I came to Ybor City alone. Ybor City was at its nadir in 1977 when I arrived in July of 1977. But to go into the mutual aid societies, the l'Unione Italiana, the El Centro Español, El Centro Asturiano, these are just astounding institutions. I had never seen anything on that scale and scope, and was a historian's wonderland. Even most astonishingly, almost nothing had been done on an academic basis on Ybor City. 42 years later, Ybor City is a cottage industry. I think there's something like 9 books now on Ybor City. There are books on Afro-Cubans in Ybor City, women in Ybor City, and it's fun to see a next generation. Forgot her name. A young scholar is at USF studying now, but she's working on what's interesting. It's Ybor City, 1931-1961. It's very logical in terms of 1931, Great Depression. You have the last great strike, the end of La Lectura, the reading in the factories, and 60s, the beginning of urban renewal. What an appropriate cigar label, by the way. If you've never had an opportunity to look at cigar label art, it's a pretty astonishing art process. So very complicated. It's called chromolithography. Most of these labels were made in Germany, not in the United States, through a very complicated process involving Bavarian limestone and ink and water. Just no way you could do this now. Figure out what I do with my phone. And this is a perfect one linking U.S. and appropriately, I spent the summer in Valencia, Spain, the birthplace of Vicente Martinez Ybor. Tried a little research there. It's just, he was born 201 years ago in Valencia, Spain. Ironically, that area of Spain has little to do with the history of Ybor City. I assume you've you've encountered Ybor. Fascinating story, patron in the cigar industry. I should have brought the document. The document's very interesting. Why would Ybor leave Key West, where he was doing quite well, and move to Tampa? And obviously, Tampa had a railroad connection, a harbor, but if you go to the city archives, the Board of Trade, it was called, I think at that time, the city of Tampa promised Ybor vigilant protection against anarchists, communists, unionists, etc. So Ybor wanted what every dean, college president, boss wants, control of his workforce. And ironically, the workforce was pretty uncontrollable. But a fascinating character, worthy of new study. I've been told, and I asked a number of Spanish scholars this summer, the name was probably originally Ibor, and many people think that's probably a Moorish name, so he was probably a Morisco, I guess, right? And the family hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But deserving more study. It's an astounding figure. Ybor City, a skyline view. The most interesting city I ever encountered as a historian. Let me look a little bit about my own background coming to Ybor City, which shaped my views. My family, my grandmother and grandfather came to Napoleonville, Louisiana. Anyone ever been to Napoleonville, Louisiana? Pretty arid place. And my grandfather cut sugarcane. If you begin your life cutting sugarcane, there's a lot of room for upward mobility. And after about 10 years, they found out that Mr. Rockefeller was building an oil refinery on the Mississippi River opposite St. Louis in Illinois. And something like 500 people from Napoleonville, all Sicilians from the small town of Alia in Sicily, left. And anyone here ever been to Wood River, Illinois? My hometown had 5 oil refineries. Nearby it had 2 steel mills. It had a ammunition plant, a slaughterhouse, a dreamland if you were the uneducated son of an immigrant. These were mostly union jobs. They were pretty decent jobs. And there was a community called Little Italy. And there was a Sons of Italy Hall, which was not bigger than this room. And I did my dissertation on the Hill in St. Louis. Anyone been to the Hill in St. Louis? Until I arrived in Ybor City, it was the most interesting place I'd ever studied. A shaky beginning, though. So I'd never been there. I lived 25 minutes from the Hill. I had never been there. My world was like this small. And I go there as a grad student just to look around. And I'm not even sure I'm on the Hill. And I see this big guy walking around. And I said, "Excuse me, is this Dago Hill?" Which everyone called it. And he comes over, grabs me by the collar, and said, "Son, you better be Italian." Fortunately, I passed the test. And I did my dissertation on the Hill. And so my wife and I had a contract for 6 months in 1973. I was going to do all my research. I go to the archives, and there's nothing. I mean, there's not a single document on the Hill. And I'm thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do. Historians need papers to analyze. I don't have any papers. No one's interested in this place. I can't even get my rent back. And so I said, I've got to do something. So I went out and bought a very inexpensive tape recorder. And I started interviewing anyone I saw over the age of 50. I do 4 or 5 interviews a day for 6 months. I had like 300 interviews. And I realized this is better than a paper in an archive. This is the human memory. Now you argue not every human memory is accurate. But, and sometimes I stumble upon amazing things. So I'm interviewing the director of a funeral home named Correnti. And he's telling me, he said, "You realize this is the anniversary." He said, this would have been 40 years ago. No, this would have been 1973. 23 years ago I played on the American World Cup team that beat Italy. The greatest upset in World Cup history, 5 of the starters for the U.S. team were from the Hill in St. Louis. A place better known for baseball players, Yogi Berra and Joe Garagiola. So I was working on that, and then in 1977, I moved to Tampa. And so I had the Hill book out of the way. So I said, I wonder if this will work in Tampa. And the first day here, I interviewed Tony Pizzo, who I'll show you later. Tony's in bronze in a slide later. But I probably interviewed several hundred people here. I wish I had interviewed more. But it's an interesting approach. Now, fortunately, Tampa, unlike the Hill, has an unbelievable archive of written works. Ybor City was a very literate community. Not every newspaper survived, not every magazine, but they were also, as you heard earlier, they were producing plays here. A few weeks ago, we had the director of the National Endowment for the Humanities touring Ybor City, and he was astounded when I told him the only Spanish language production of the Federal Theater during the New Deal occurred at the Centro Historiano. Manuel Aparicio, a former reader, was one of the directors there. So Ybor City lives. I mean, it's really fun to see the next generation of scholars looking at it, criticizing you, which is all right, that's fine. But I'm a very lucky man to be there. You know, the course I teach more often now than immigration history is food history. I've been doing a class on food and history. There's a great book there for someone on Ybor City. I didn't ask food questions, but reviewing, I look back and food always came up. I remember in St. Louis, I interviewed this guy. If I could have had a videotape, his name was Anthony Rancilio, who was a blacksmith, a fabbro ferraio in Italian, and he lights a De Nobili cigar with a burning faggot. I mean, that's a rather dramatic case. His father had been a blacksmith. There were clay mines in St. Louis. Anyway, I asked him, so how did your family come to America? He said, very simple. He said, my father wrote my mother from St. Louis and said, Caterina, in America we eat meat 3 times a day, not 3 times a year. Bring Tony to America. It's as simple as that. In this case, Giuseppina Spoto told me in Tampa there was no scarcity of anything. How in Ybor City they used to make coffee in a big pot. Coffee, something you don't think about, but if you were living in an interior village in Spain or in Sicily, coffee, people told me in Sicily you got it maybe twice a year. You're at Christmas and Easter. Coffee's just not, but Cubans obviously had lots of coffee. They brought this coffee culture at Ybor City. There's practically a book on this as well. If you go to a city directory in 1910 and you look under coffee roasters in Tampa, there's like 9 coffee roasters, 8 of them in Ybor City or West Tampa. Coffee roasting, it was a big business. And remember, Giuseppina told me, can you imagine reading this in a letter, a relative? Sometimes we just throw away the coffee. We're tired of after 6 cups of coffee, we can't drink anymore. First brick factory, or the first brick building in Ybor City, first brick factory was the VM Ybor factory. You've all seen the famous photograph of Jose Marti standing on those steps. It's about as iconic a photograph as you can imagine. Question I would have, who builds a factory these days with cast iron steps? What does that tell you? Your commitment to the community, your vision of the future. Ybor's an old man, by the way, by the time he builds that factory. He's 60 years old. An old man by the
Sorry.
I remember going, by the way, to, I think it was Perfecto Garcia's last day. So I stand outside for about 3 hours waiting for the workers to come out. And this worker came out and she stops and she said, we're the last of the Mohicans. But another one said, we used to call this factory El Paraíso because there was this paradise tree growing nearby. So it wasn't just a factory, the factories had names and nicknames. The famous photograph. Probably, you can make an argument, that's got to be one of the top 5 photographs. History of Tampa, maybe Cubans in America. Any idea who would have taken that photograph? I wonder if I don't think that was the Berger brothers. The Monet factory, this is what's interesting here. This nearly burned about 20 years ago in a fire in Ybor. This is an 1890s factory. Marti visited that factory, by the way, once, and it's still standing today. Not only still standing, this is what it looks like today, believe it or not. You can see the top when the renovations had just begun. There'd be some interesting ghosts in that factory, also interesting smells. Perfecto Garcia factory, of the Paraíso tree. To me, this is the most interesting factory in Tampa. When I bring guests down, or if I take students for a tour, I take them and we stop in front of the factory. First of all, you have to realize it's in the middle of a residential neighborhood. If you didn't, you're building factories. Now, when the factory was built, there may not have been a neighborhood there, but it is now. And if you had been blindfolded and they said, okay, where are you? And all you saw is that, you would say, it's 13th century Spain. That's the Spanish Romanesque church tower. Who builds a factory, really a wasted tower? There's not much room for a tower other than a clock, except you're part of a community. It's more than simply a factory. There's a wonderful, in Italian, the name for a bell tower, church bell tower, is a campanile. And there's this wonderful Italian word, I don't think it exists in Spanish, called campanilismo, which means bell towerness, whatever bell towerness means. Anyone know what it translates as? You don't trust anyone who cannot hear the toll of your neighborhood church bell. It's a very Italian thing. You don't trust strangers. You certainly don't trust the state, but you trust your relatives and your neighbors. And every block in Italy has a church tower. What inappropriate. Have you seen this before? This is
I don't know if we've seen
a
so many.
romanticized view of the Tampa. You're here, by the way. This is.
Yeah, I don't remember there being a beach in downtown.
That's the swamp.
You don't remember the gondolas going up and down the river?
They just forgot to pay the gators.
Well, Ybor City, we often confuse it. You know, we concentrate on labor relations, but it was a community. And one of the most difficult groups to judge in the community is the Jewish community, small Jewish community. Most of them did not live in Ybor City. And I don't know really how to analyze the Ybor City Jewish community. Interestingly, most of them came from Romania to Cuba. So they all spoke Spanish. And so they were in Ybor. Of Ybor, they certainly supported causes of various kinds in Ybor City. But I don't know whether there's a book you could do on Ybor City Jews, but you've got a number of the buildings, department stores, small D, in Ybor City.
There's a book, they had a book on it in the,
Really?
in
Okay,
the Tampa
good.
Bay, the music.
Okay.
And they just screened a documentary it has extensive footage of EJ talking on the Ybor City Jews.
Yeah, okay. Bread and roses. To me, I've always made this point, if every image in Ybor City was destroyed, let's say there's a neutron archival bomb, they destroyed every image, every building, we had one artifact left, this, probably about 1,900 postcard was left. I think to me, this postcard, this image encapsulates Ybor City. Everything you'd want to know about Ybor leaps out of here. So let's look at this collectively. Think of the journalistic who, what, why, when, where. Most importantly, why. But so I already said it's about 1900. What strikes you as interesting or significant in this photo? Yes, ma'am.
So I've noticed that of the books we've been reading a lot in the Institute, that this and another are the two photos that appear most frequently when talking about Ybor City cigar factories. And this one I like much better because it includes the multiracial dimension of Ybor City.
Think of this. This is 1900. The date is irrelevant. It could be 1890. It could be 1920. This is not just the South. This is the Deep South. What would have happened in Durham, North Carolina, at a cigar factory if a black man worked next to a white woman? You know the answer. Other than Key West, I think this is the only community in the South that you would have black men working next to white women. But the story is not as simple as that. Who are the black men?
Afro-Cubans.
Afro-Cubans. They're not, which leads to a complicated discussion of race in Latin America. It's not the same. In America, it's the one drop rule. Here in Ybor City, I interviewed more than a few Afro-Cubans who said you could ride the streetcar in the front if you wanted, as long as you were in Ybor City. Once you passed Nebraska Avenue, you went to the back. So Ybor City, I would argue fluidity. Now, Professor Greenbaum was here. We disagree, I think, we disagree on a lot of issues, but to me, Ybor City, I'm not going to use the word racial paradise, but it was as fluid a place in the American South as you can imagine. Was it discrimination? Certainly. But compared to what would be my question? I think it was probably the freest community for a black man, black woman, immigrant in certainly the Deep South in America. What else? Yes, EJ.
That photograph is so unique because look at what is hanging from each of the rafters.
Were those buckets of water, I assume?
There was no, what do you call the,
Extinguishers?
what do you call the things that automatically?
Sprinklers. Right.
Fire extinguishers.
Yes.
And if you will notice carefully, they are not the square bottom buckets. At the bottom is circular. Why? Because the manufacturer did not want them taking them off of the rafter and sitting it down.
Interesting.
So you could not sit that bucket. And that was the major enemy of the cigar industry.
Sure.
Fire.
Yeah, wooden factories, also homes. If you went into the Ybor City casita, imagine a fire-burning place there. Lots of fires in Ybor City. Other things, yes, ma'am?
Just two quick questions. So what were those buckets made from, and what was the problem with setting them on the floor as extinguishing mechanisms?
They might drop the water and not refill it or whatever. So they thought if we had a circular bottom, they would not be putting it down. They would always have it there and there would be water.
I'm guessing they're made of leather. What would you think? You think they're made of leather? What else springs out in your mind? Race, obviously, is the most important. Yes.
Multiple ages.
Yes, and you see very young people. The kid who looks like alfalfa, they're behind the woman, third row, is underage. By the way, that underage workers were rampant in Ybor. No one paid any attention to the law at this time. So that's, I don't think anyone's ever mentioned that before. You're right. It's a very cross-section What else?
It's manual labor. Manual labor. There's
Yeah,
no.
these are all tabaqueros.
Tabaquero.
They're rolling the cigar. This is a very skilled process. We'll talk about how one became a tabaquero. There's a real hierarchy in the cigar industry. What about their dress? Think, this is industrial America in 1900 at its peak. Do you think, now interestingly, I don't see any cigar or coffee cups on the table. Often you do. They won the right to drink cafe con leche
The guy
at
in
work.
front looks like he's got one.
Oh, you're right, thank you. Front row, top right.
And there's one next to the.
Workers in a strike, in 1899, there was a wait strike. Oh, yeah. Classic strike, you gotta love this. So, management decreed, there's too much waste. What we're gonna do now is, you're gonna get a pound of tobacco. Out of that, we want, let's say, 9 cigars. We fear people are taking this home. And the workers struck saying, you've questioned our integrity. Not only have you come, we're not strike, we want to strike, and one of the things we want, of course, the reader to continue, but we wanted the right to drink cafe at the coffee benches. And they won that, and there was a man called El Cafetero, a dear friend of ours, Garcia. What was his first name?
Willie Garcia.
Willie Garcia. His father ran the Atlanta Cafe restaurant, and as young Willie was a cafetero as a young boy. Another job in the factory was the, come on, do you say knife? That's
Chaveta?
chavetero, the
Yeah.
chavetero. Always a gallego, I think, sharpen the knife. So there's kind of, to me, we need to move this along. It's the dress. Think of this, industrial America. How many, do you think the workers at Homestead, at Carnegie's Mill, the workers at Rockefeller's oil refinery, at Ford's Motor Company are wearing white shirts to work? Are you kidding me? But what does that tell you? What does that mean? They're wearing white shirts.
It was a statement.
It was a clean environment.
The clean environment, to me, it's the dignity. I'm not a mere laborer. I'm an artisan. It takes 6 months to learn to be a tabaquero. I think it's a statement that we have dignity and we're not going to be pushed around. I mean, but that's interesting in terms of discussion. You could discuss that issue a lot, but here's another issue. You see a sea of white shirts. That one you don't see as many women. The women tend to be in the very back. This is a 1929 photograph, and
I think this is a woman here on the second row.
Yeah, just right behind the.
Behind comb over, man.
Has her back.
where's the?
It's a little red button. It's right in the middle there.
Where is?
Second row.
Yes. But if you look back there, there's female. At this time, by the 1930s, most of the workers in the cigar industry were female. A lot of Italians had decided, by the 30s, you can see the cigar industry is beginning to decline. Whereas in 1900, this was a well-paid industry. I calculated a cigar worker in Tampa earned about the same salary as a union carpenter in Chicago, with about half the cost of living. Now there's some caveats. You have temporary shortages, strikes. This is a very tempestuous industry. It's also a very stratified industry. You had all these jobs. I don't have a picture of one, but imagine telling your school teacher, my mother is a stripper at the cigar factory. And the strippers, was it Despadiadores, I think? They strip the tobacco leaf. Think of the tobacco leaf as like rhubarb. So you're stemming, you're taking the leaf from the stem. Those were generally Italian laborers at the lowest. These selectors, this was a premium job to select the right leaf for the right cigar. You don't want to be using a cheap leaf in an expensive cigar, vice versa. you also, as was mentioned, you had lots of child laborers. And at Chinchal, the joke was, I think, that they were like bed bugs. There's so many, but you would often, what would happen, your father would apprentice you to a Chinchal. And he'd pay a modest amount, you'd work there, you'd be an apprentice for 6 months. Then you'd be able to get your own job. And I mean, people told me that you could walk across the street and get a job. There was always an opening in the cigar factories. We have to step back to 1900. Every main street in America had several newsstands. All the newsstands had cigar boxes. It had to do with status. A businessman shouldn't be smoking a cheap cigar. A middle-class businessman should be smoking a Puro Habana cigar for status. And until the Great Depression, it's a growth industry. Look at all these kids.
There's one young woman on the, right.
Oh yes, look at that.
Yeah.
I never noticed her. This guy could be my grandfather. This is a dead ringer. He looks like kind of Fagin with the young kids, by the way. This breaks your heart, doesn't it? Anyone know who the photographer is? This is not just a photographer from the Tampa Tribune. This is the most famous photographer in America, Lewis Hines.
Right.
So in 1909, one of the great concerns in America, among American reformers, was child labor. The laws were inconsistent and rarely enforced. But how do you get your message out? You can write articles, but no one reads them. Lewis Hines said, print amplifies, a photograph dramatizes. It's really true. You can write about young girls working, but that picture is kind of heartbreaking there. Particularly, Italians were particularly prone to this. The idea, there's a famous Italian proverb, like the fingers of the five fingers of the hand, the fist is stronger than any individual finger. And the idea is, the only way you're going to make it is to everyone contributing to the economy. And they didn't want to hear, but you're sacrificing your child's, it's about family. And you pay a modest amount, and then you could get a pretty decent job. So Lewis Hines, that's me interviewing the very young Gary Mormino, by the way. You won't care. You know, I thought, we'll come to the other Lewis Hines in a little bit.
My grandfather.
This is his grandfather. I didn't realize this and I'm not sure. Any idea where I got? Did I get that from you or?
You may have. I don't know.
I interviewed his grandfather.
When you interviewed my grandfather, I was a small child, so it
I
wasn't
remember
bad.
you were this tall. You said you wanted to be a professor. Get a real job, kid. Get a real job. He was believed to be the last reader.
We got that on tape, Michael.
But think about this. This card would get you in any cafe in Ybor City. I interviewed one of EJ's closest friends, Cesar Medina, and he told me his father worked as a reader. And imagine he said one day, he said to young Cesar, I'll take you. But before they went to work, they always went to a favorite cafe. The readers had their own round table, room for like a dozen readers. And they walk into the cafe, he said there's a crowd like of 60 people circling the cafe. And they're present simply to hear the readers argue about the day's readings. And he said he remembered the crowd parted and they would be whispering, there's the reader, Mr. Medina. I mean, this was a rock star job at the time. Have you talked about the reader in here before?
Yeah.
Okay. To me, it's the most interesting institution in Ybor City. Wow. I don't think we have any idea how many readers there were. There obviously were hundreds. There was at least one Italian reader, Onofrio Palermo, Nelson Palermo's father. The most famous female reader was Luisa Capetillo, Puerto Rican woman, very famous activist at this time, always in Spanish, which is why all the Italians really preferred Spanish to Italian. And they weren't really even speaking Italian, they were speaking Sicilian dialect. But from 1886 to 1931, and another close friend of ours, Armando Mendez, told me he was working in a cigar factory when they ended the reading. They ended the La Lectura. And because he could read well, they asked him to show up 15 minutes before they went to work, and he would read outside the cigar factory on the steps to assembled workers there, just as an informal tribute to the readers. Isn't that a great picture? I mean, that's just as dramatic a picture as you can imagine. I don't know if that's Aparicio, but I remember, it's interesting, I interviewed more women than men, and when I would ask the women, all in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, who were your favorite readers? They gasped, they said, oh my God, Aparicio, Rodriguez, and they said sometimes readers had such powerful voices. Women would come with parasols outside the window of the factory simply to listen to the readers' voices. And a good reader had to keep you wanting to come back, so it was a serialized novel. So a Victor Hugo novel would take a month to read. So you have to find out what happens to Esperanza. Is that a great picture? I mean, the Count, the Conde, I mean.
When is that one from?
What's that?
Do you know what year this one is?
I don't. I don't have any idea. I could find out if you wanted to know, because I know who gave me the photograph.
Were there black
That-
readers?
That photograph comes from your book,
Yes, and
and the girl that helped you
You're-
put it together,
you're exactly
that
right.
was her grandfather.
Yes. Boy, how in the world do you remember that? I'm amazed. I took some photographs to be reproduced, and it was a very young girl at the time. She said, you know, my uncle or grandfather was a reader. So that's how that picture got in the book. Religion in Ybor City is a very prickly topic. Now, full disclaimer, I have a sister who's a cloistered nun. So I don't come as a raging anti-cleric. And that is the key word, anti-clericalism. Ybor City, West Tampa people were religious, but they were anti-clerical. They did not like the priest much. And for good reason, probably. If you were in Sicily or Spain in the late 19th century, the church owned most of the land. The church was backing the landed interest at this time. There's all sorts of proverbs about fat priests and etc. But they would come to the religious festival days. Each of the four groups brought their separate patron saints. So on the left is Santiago, the Moor slayer, Matamoros, about as politically incorrect a saint as you can find these days, trampling Moors. There's a town in both Mexico and Spain called Matamoros.
Yeah, border town.
And that's La Caridad de Cobre. What's interesting is, I talk a lot about this in the book I'm writing now. It's about Florida up to 2019. And in 1999-2000, young Elian Gonzalez is found clutching a boy, B-U-O-Y, and they brought him back. And Cubans in Miami say, my God, this is the miracle of La Caridad de Cobre. The storm on the high seas, young boy catching this. This is right out of Shakespeare's The Tempest, and a touching story, the ending of that, by the way. Obviously, Janet Reno directed that he be reunited with his father. Probably cost Al Gore the election in 2000. I'm absolutely convinced that it galvanized the Cuban vote. But last year, at Janet Reno's funeral, someone said there's a call. So Janet Reno's sister answers it. It's from the Cuban embassy. And they said, the Gonzalez family would like to thank you, would like to thank the family of Janet Reno for reuniting him with his family. This is the church in Ybor City. Now, what's interesting to me, this is obviously a combustible issue. I got more flack over the chapter on religion than any other chapter in the book. Because a lot of people said, what do you mean? My mother was a saint. She was religious. What are you saying? And I didn't say your mother wasn't religious. For instance, if you go to the church registers, which I did, most of that first generation was married by notary publics. Now, you always, EJ, what do they always say to a lawyer? Never ask a question if what? If you don't know the answer. I've never asked our esteemed leader here, your grandparents' attitude toward Catholic Church.
Oh, well, my grandfather, when his grandsons got married in the church, he would go to the weddings and sit on the steps outside of the church because he refused to walk inside of the church. I went through a little religious phase, and when I was a kid, and I'd try to say grace at dinner, and my other grandfather would get a spoon and bang his glass and go ting, 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 ting until I was finished praying, and then he'd put it down.
Now, EJ, I think, has an alternative view. Let's go ahead.
One of our most famous educators,
Yes, I know who you're talking about.
one of our most famous educators in Hillsborough County has a school named for him. We go by his initials.
Yes, for good reason.
A.T. Leto, L-E-T-O. Nobody ever questions what does the A stand for. It stands for ateo, which means atheist. You name the child atheist.
I interviewed an elderly Spanish American. I think you knew him. Desturian Iglesias. His parents destroyed the church. So, but think about this. If you had never been, I'm guessing most of you had never been to Ybor City before. So what you're expecting. So here's a community that was laid out by a Spanish engineer, Gavino Gutierrez. You're expecting what at the center of this very well-planned city? You would expect the church. The church is kind of off to the side. I would argue the church in Ybor City was the Mutual Aid Society. That's one reason they're so over the top. Your keys down there, by the way, on the floor. On the other hand, Harry Truman said, aren't there two armed economists that are always saying, on the one hand, on the other hand? If you go to, on the edge of Ybor City, near downtown Tampa, is a place called Peter Claver School. And this was a school for Afro-Cuban Catholics, a well-known school. And Peter Claver, I always wondered, that's a strange name. I'm in New Mexico a few years ago. I see a statue to Pedro Claver, saint to the slaves. And this is Peter Claver there. So it's a complicated story. The Sicilians had Santa Rosalia. This is why so many Italian girls are named Rose. I love Proverbs. I'm working on a novel about Italian immigrants now, and I've introduced a character named Johnny Proverb, who was kicked in the head as a child, so he's adult. He's the village fool, but if you ask him a question, he only can speak in Proverbs. So Victor Hugo is appropriate. When Notre Dame burned, I immediately thought, oh my God, there's only one city in America that has the intimate connection to Victor Hugo as Tampa. And so I wrote an article for the Tampa Bay Times on this, and I'm saying that if anytime between 1886 and 1931, a reader was reading Hunchback of Notre Dame or Los Miserables to cigar workers. And he was their hero. I gave my treasured Victor Hugo cigar label to our esteemed leader here. You think about it, his heroes were their heroes. The young student idealist, the pious village priest. His enemies were their enemies, the corrupt attorney general, the archbishop who is insensitive to the people's needs. The greatest quote I ever got from so I'm interviewing Jose Vega Diaz. Mr. Vega is about 95 years old. I think he was the oldest interview I had. He came here in the 1890s. It's an amazing story. He marries Blanca. They'd been married 60 years. The night before, an urban renewal guy comes and paints a white X on their home in Ybor City, which means it's going to be torn down tomorrow. Blanca dies that night. Broken heart. She dies. So I'm interviewing him, and I ask him, you're supposed to ask neutral questions, okay? So the question I asked is, could you talk about religion in Ybor City? I want to hear, you don't ask, I understand people were hostile to the church. That's not a good question to ask. So he answers me in, would you read this? Would you be our lector for today?
You know what Victor Hugo say? In every town and every place they have a school teacher. The school teacher is the light. And in every town there is someone who try to blow away the light, the preachers.
Is that a great line? I mean, at first he didn't answer the question, but how many 90-year-old people answer questions in metaphors? The anarchist community in Ybor City. Now this is interesting. It's also very personal. So, the book has just been published in 1987, and I get a phone call. I'm in my office at USF Tampa in the library. And a guy on the phone says, are you one of the authors of this book? And I said, yes. He said, would you turn to page 148, read me the second line from the bottom. And so I read, other anarchists such as Pietro Scaglione, Salvatore Lodato, he said, stop, that's my father. Luigi Lodato is my father. He said, you called my father an anarchist. He said, are you going to be in your office in a few minutes? He said, I'm going to come by and kick your ass. How many of you have this problem in your writing? And indeed, he comes by. Now, fortunately, he's my age in 1987, and he's absolutely ricocheting off the walls. And his father was a son. And I call my colleague. I didn't even write this line. My colleague wrote the line, and he looks at, he said, he belonged to all the anarchist societies. He subscribed to all the anarchist we found out that Mr. Lodato was in seminary and kicked out of the seminary for his political views, came to Tampa, and so he introduced me to his brothers. Did you know the Lodato brothers? They were all World War II vets. I mean, you got only in America, fathers and anarchists, 5 sons World War II vets. And they used to take me to Alvarez Restaurant in Ybor City. And we got along very well. And then I get a package in the mail from the Lodato brothers. And it's a book. It's not a bomb, it's a book. And the title is Our Father the Anarchist. They concluded their father indeed was an anarchist, but it's not a bad word. That I always ask my students, so what would happen if you brought the love of your life home to your father or mother, and they were saying, so Tom or Judy, tell us about your dreams. And I said, well, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in the state or laws. I say, mother or father, would you push this relationship forward? Probably not. But the word has come to, it's all words change over time. But anarchism, I'm not sure I'd say flourished in Ybor City, but it was found prominently in Ybor City. First of all, you have to look at the roots of this. In 19th century Spain, if there's a word to describe 19th century Spain, it's inequality. Something like 90%, I think like 98% of the land is owned either by the church or landed interest. Particularly in Asturias and Galicia, where the Spaniards came from, people lived on these very small farms with all these medieval customs, quit rents and all these things. And Spain is absolutely in a free fall from 1800 to 1898. The century begins, Spain is still an empire. By 1899, Spain has lost Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico. Moreover, it's lost earlier in the 19th century, Argentina, Mexico, almost all of Latin and South America. Spain has been reduced to a third-rate power. And it's humiliating, and it's kind of backward government, and people are desperate. I write in the book that in Sicily, you had three choices by 1890. You could rebel, you could immigrate, or you could stagnate. If you were a young woman, by the way, your chances, instead of stagnate, if you were the youngest daughter, your job was the zitella. You were the old maid. You were not to marry, you were to take care of the elderly relatives. And in Spain, and certainly in parts of Asturias and Galicia, and in Sicily as well, Sicily, very similar conditions, people rebelled. What's interesting about this, in Spain, you have anarchism flourishes at the village level, which is more, but also in densely populated cities, such as Barcelona. This is one of the most famous incidents in Spanish history, the 1893 bombing. An anarchist throws a bomb, an Orsini bomb on the right, into the opera house. Why would you throw a bomb in an opera house? That's where rich people are. And you know what the result is going to be. There's going to be a crackdown. That's all right, because that proves our point that the state is oppressive. And from the perspective of 2019, it seems insane. The idea that society is going to reach this perfect harmony if we could only get rid of the church, the state, and the military.
Sounds good
How
to me.
exactly do you get rid of the state and the military? And in Tampa, I should add, most of the anarchists were peaceful anarchists who believed in education. But if you think about it, a cigar factory is a perfect ideal for them, where the workers would assemble outside, and they would, you would create laws, or actually no laws, but just suggestions, customs, that people would live quite harmoniously. But the government is not going to peacefully fade away. And so they believed in this, it was the doctrine called propaganda by deed. That is, and the ultimate is going to be the general strike, where everyone goes on strike and the state is pulled out. These are incidents in Spanish history. Something like 3 or 4 prime ministers were assassinated. By the way, the King of Italy was also killed. The potential assassin of Franklin Roosevelt tried to kill the King of Italy. I was outside in Madrid. I saw the marker where the Prime Minister of Spain, Canovas, was shot in 1897. William McKinley, the President of the United States, was killed in 1901 by an anarchist. And an assassin, Manuel Padrinas, was the assassin of the Spanish Prime Minister in, I think, 1912, Canalejas. Which leads to the Great Crackdown. The first Great Crackdown was World War I. And as I'm reading all the English language newspapers in Tampa, I was struck. There's never a mention about a Red Scare in Ybor City. I mean, Ybor City was bristling with left-wing newspapers, etc. And I found out later the reason was they didn't publicize this. I went to the National Archives, and there's the forerunner of the FBI was called the Bureau of Justice. And if you had names, you simply, they were all, and so all these union leaders, by the way, including Victoriano Montega, they all had files on them, and they talked about they would smashed newspaper presses, etc. And the leftist community in Ybor City really took a beating during in the aftermath of World War I. Here's from a Department of Justice official, March 1919 and January 1920. Imagine when this hit the newspaper, I can state that the Italian and Spanish colonies of West Tampa and Ybor City are the most advanced toward the social revolution. I should say they have established here a Soviet on a small scale. I have the impression of being in Russia. Now, a little melodramatic, but you're trying to impress your bosses. On the other hand, lest you think I'm a left-wing fanatic, I think one of the reasons you could argue the left wing ultimately failed, or certainly diminished in Tampa, was that capitalism worked. I know this is a dramatic announcement. Most immigrants in Ybor City did so much better than they could have in Spain or Sicily or Cuba that why would you want to bring the government down? You own your own home. An Italian proverb, chi attraversa il mare si compra la casa. He who crosses the ocean buys a house. You couldn't buy your own farm or house in Spain or Sicily and many in Cuba. That the system really did work. This is the most dramatic. I don't know if you were involved with this, EJ. So about 10 years ago, the Heinz Society, the photographer, what's his first name? Louis Heinz Society. They had a fascinating question. It was the 100th anniversary of the photographs. And the question they had, whatever happened to these kids that no one knows? So I get a phone call. Within 3 minutes, I had an answer. I called Joe Caltagirone, and I sent him the photograph. And he said, I remember old man Valenti telling me that someone took a picture of him when he was a young kid. And the back of the photograph revealed the name Valenti. But in Spanish and Italian, we often flip the B's and the D's. And this was, I think his name was Louis Valenti. His brother was Blue Eyes Valenti, the biggest wholesale tomato. And this guy became a millionaire, by the way. He became a wholesale fruit and vegetable dealer. Only in America, only in Tampa. But you look at the kid, do you want to hug him or run away? I mean, the hair looks like it's been washed about 3 years ago. Barefoot, I mean, even if Heinz staged this next to a dump, this doesn't look like Horatio Alger, but it was Horatio Alger. I think the moderating institutions were also the mutual aid societies. How are we doing time-wise, by the way?
We'll take a break in about 10 minutes,
Okay.
and then you'll have an hour
Yeah, very good.
afterwards.
The mutual aid societies, when I came here, this floored me more than anything else. I had been to more than a few Italian mutual aid societies in New York, in St. Louis, in Chicago. Most of them could fit in this room. They were generally dilapidated, wooden, very narrowly organized around neighborhoods in Italy. And the first economic crisis you have, they generally fold. Here in Ybor City, my God, they're on a scale and scope and a beauty that I'd never seen before. These were cathedrals. Someone told me they were cathedrals for the working classes. I mean, it's a beautiful name, a kind of a secular church in a lot of ways. And the idea that you would carry around your membership card, many interviewees told me, my father enrolled me in the Cuban club, the Italian club, the day I was born. That's when I joined this club, the day I was born. So you had the Cuban club there. Who builds institutions like that in America? Certainly not the Polish Falcons in Philadelphia. That's like a 5-story building. It once had the greatest dance floor I had ever seen, with a mural of Columbia on the ceiling. By the way, I would take students to these. I bet I took 100 groups of students there, and as late as about 20 years ago, you could walk in, and there'd be, at the Centro Asturiano in the cantina, there'd be 60 old-timers there playing cards and always willing to talk. And now they're pretty silent places. I mean, for a variety of reasons. I had never seen anything like El Centro Asturiano. I mean, this is that theater. You went into the theater, I saw. Oh my God, the theater. It looks like the Barcelona Opera House. Seriously, it's Baroque. And you just close your eyes. I was there one day with students, and there was an old guy repairing the chairs. And he told me, he said, I bet you've never noticed, there are 3 sizes of chairs, depending on your girth. And we've grown since 1918, by the way. The chairs don't fit as well now. This is the Centro Español, which that building no longer functions as that. But I did a lot of interviews in this. Look at you've got mosaic floors, just extraordinary. By the way, what you don't see there, I almost never saw a woman there. I mean, it's really interesting. Even the late 20th century, this was pretty much a masculine island. Now, during the week, on Saturday nights, you'd have a performance at the club, at the theater. You had picnics often on Sunday. Families obviously would belong.
Dances on the 2nd floor, and that's where the women had their club meetings, on the 2nd floor. But nobody ever took their pictures.
I talked to, oh gosh, her name's escaping me now, it's not important, but a scene worthy of a movie. It's the Italian woman, the dancer, but anyway, she's saying she was there at the 2nd floor of the Centro Español, December the 7th, 1941. They had tea dances there. And her chaperone, her aunt was the chaperone, walking like 5 feet behind. And that was very popular, common among Sicilians to have a chaperone. And in the middle of the concert, Don Francisco, the maestro, takes the microphone and says, I hate to do this, he said, but it's canceled. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. And there were lots of young men in uniform dancing. The men are to be outside, a bus will be awaiting you. And the woman told me all the women went over the balcony and were crying as the bus drove away. I mean, just very Hollywood-esque. For sheer splash, the entrance of the Centro Español in West Tampa, that's been closed to members for how long, EJ?
It's
30
been
years?
closed, I think, since 1970.
Yeah, a long time. But look at that. The artwork, the Moorish designs there. It was used as a movie theater, as were many of the mutual aid societies later. In addition to having lavish clubhouses, the Spanish in particular were progressive. You can make an argument the best medical care in the state of Florida came at the sanitariums, the hospitals of the Centro Español and the Centro Asturiano. I mean, look at that. That's a hospital on Bayshore Boulevard, no less. I mean, we're talking, there were also private clinics. This was a private clinic. So Ybor City probably had the best medical care of any immigrant community in the United States. And I interviewed several physicians, most notably Dr. Adamo, today's Adam O'Brien. He told me that if you practice group care, what they would do is it's called contract medicine. People call it socialized medicine. It has nothing to do with the government. Basically, the clubs would contract a physician saying, you're to work full-time for us for the year for $2,500. And that's how it worked. The American Medical Association blackballed you if you worked for the clubs. You could never work in private practice again. They would not sanction your contract. They did not like this.
Why?
For somehow it was hinting of collectivism, although it was private enterprise. I mean, but AMA. Best photograph I think I ever took. So what values emanate from that photograph of Joe Maniscalco, who had, I think, a 4th grade education, and I mean, I think that's a pretty dingy little room, but look at the dignity of that man. The way the cigars are rolled in absolute beautiful detail. And if I'm not mistaken, his sons were surgeons, but he was still rolling cigars because that's what he liked to do. He is a major player in an event the next hour. He's the president of the Italian Club in November 1955 when he announces that someone wanted to use the club to talk, and he said, he had to look down, he said, Fidel Castro wants to talk. And I'll explain that story next hour. But this might be a good place to end it. Are we pretty close?
Yeah.
In terms of movie-worthy lines, so I'm interviewing Angelina Spoto Comascone. And I ask her, tell us what you would be doing in the evenings. Dan, would you read that? Would you read in the evenings? Would you read that?
Oh, me with the accent, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, in the evening, our parents will take us walking. We will love one another. We will sing as loud as we could, Italian, Spanish, and American songs. Nobody walks anymore. Nobody sings anymore.
Beautiful. Is that a beautiful remembrance? I mean, and my point, you don't find those lines in an archive. You really don't. And by the way, if someone wanted to do a history of Ybor City, every single person I interviewed except Joe Caltadrone is dead. Of the 190 interviews, I think. Yes, ma'am.
Would you interview the people in English, or would they?
It was always
speak
in
to you?
English. I hardly knew any Spanish at that time. My Italian was pretty decent, but and they spoke Sicilian dialect, so it was almost always in English. They peppered it with phrases, etc. And I wish I could have been here 10 years earlier. I mean, shall we break?
Yeah. Take
Shall
a
we
10
dance?
minutes.
In Buenos Aires, Mexico City, and Havana. And until you saw a picture of the Havana, Centro Studiano in Havana, it's twice the size of the one here. So,
Now a national museum.
and I think this is a key point. Why, the question is, why were the mutual aid societies here built on a much larger scale and scope? And to me, the answer is that it was the model of the Spanish mutual aid societies. Whereas Italian mutual aid societies everywhere else were built around the local community where you left the old world. And you note the name of the Italian mutual aid society is not L'Unione Italiana, or rather L'Unione Siciliana. It's Italian. Rather than having 4 separate mutual aid societies, the Italians adopted the Spanish model. The other question that's come out is, how did the press cover Ybor City? Complicated question, but in general, as long as the cigar factories were humming, you have to realize these cigar factories in Tampa were producing much of the tax revenue for the city of Tampa. I mean, this is a classic economic model. You import cheap Cuban tobacco and you export expensive Cuban cigars. And there's a tax on that. So as long as Ybor City is humming, everything's fine. It is vicious once strikes occur. And by the way, many strikes. This was a fractious community. I've heard stories that the boss of the factory would be bringing a friend a tour of the factory, and the reader felt he had been interrupted and would just say, to the streets. So lots of shutdowns. I have a photograph later of Jose Iglesias, not the singer, but the author who grew up in Tampa. And I thought it was just a wonderful line. He said, in Tampa, we remembered years by what strikes occurred. Oh, 1910, that was the 10-month strike. 1921, now my abuela told me about that strike. So, the press will report Ybor City, you know, the beautiful senoritas, the romantic thing. Boy, once a strike occurs, these are dangerous anarchist fiends. Part of a larger nativism in America. Let's face it, Italians, Spaniards, and Cubans were the original bad hombres, with apologies to our Irish friends. They were really the original bad hombres. Part of the community of Ybor City, one of my favorite characters ever was Buster Agliano in Italian. But I would always begin my tours at Buster's fish restaurant, or warehouse there. And the only reason it was there, it was zoned in. And so Buster was about 300 pounds, a huge man, former football player at the University of Florida. And he would always begin asking the crowd, so what's the first name of your fishmonger? What do you think he meant by that? Really, it's the kid of Publix, right? But he said, you know, if you're going to buy fish, shouldn't you buy it from a friend or someone you trust? And it's really related to the previous comment. Nobody sings anymore, nobody talks anymore. This was a community. First name basis. You could cash your checks at the fish when you were paid Friday. To buy bacalao and things like that. I need to rush through these. Quotes, these are two of my favorite quotes. Oh my, I almost tear up. Who would you like to be Nina Tagliorina Ferlita? The minute
I saw the Statue of Liberty, I left everything behind. It was like stepping on a piece of ice, and by the time you're on the other side, it's melted. It was beautiful. Unfortunately, there was a man who died on the boat, and they had to fumigate everyone who came in. Imagine a 14-year-old kid disrobed in front of adults. They threw us on all kinds of disinfectant. The stink, I still smell it. They got those hoses like firemen have and swish all over the place. But that did not give us a bad impression of America.
Is that a beautiful quote? You know, in spite of the terrible ordeal, a searing moment, I mean, seeing someone die, it did not give us a bad impression. You know, again, a new life. And did you catch the next quote, by the way, for your newspaper? So this was from the Tampa Tribune, pertinent to my earlier talk. How did the press report? Would you like, either of you like to read at the cigar factory?
At the cigar factory of Arguelles, Lopez, and Brothers, 9 Italian women gave an entertainment that was about as ludicrous as any that has been inflicted upon the local population. The misguided ones, armed with clubs, paraded the streets about the factory. Their weapons they brandished and their tongues they did wag, giving vent to threats that they would beat all to death who would work.
EJ, I have that book back. There is a story in here. If anyone was doing a story on the Cuban War of Independence before the United States got in so imagine the setting. The message to Garcia has been delivered from Tampa that the revolution, the Cuban War of Insurrection of 1895 was to begin February 20th, which I think is the beginning of Carnival. And people were told to gather outside the old Halloran factory in West Tampa. And a Tampa reporter was covering the event. And the leader of one of the juntas in Tampa was a man named Martin Herrera. And he told him, he had 2 daughters, Pennsylvania Herrera and Pocahontas Herrera. I'm not making this up, by the way. He told Pennsylvania, if I'm not there, you have to take my place. And he deliberately didn't show up. So here's this like 10-year-old girl addressing 1,000 people who were just in patriotic furor. This is one of the best, first of all, the writing ability of reporters. This is February 24th, 1895. The shouts of the large crowd were heard for blocks around, and then silence reigned. She began her speech, and then for 20 minutes she spoke extempore in clear, measured tones, giving emphasis to her well-rounded sentences with graceful gestures which brought round after round of applause. Not a few eyes were dimmed with tears at the pathos of her eloquence. It was a scene this writer has never witnessed. A little girl pleading with the earnestness of a prince and the eloquence of a sage for the country she would lay down her pure sweet life to save from serfdom. Wow. I mean, tell me that would not be a movie moment. Pennsylvania Herrera there. We need, by the way, that's such a hilarious quote. There's enough mirth, there's also serious. Interesting question. What's the worst mass lynching in American history? It's 11 Italians in New Orleans in 1893, and I hesitate to show you this, but the worst mass lynching in Tampa was 1910 at the corner, not far from here, of Kennedy, then Lafayette, and Howard. They were accused of murdering a bookkeeper, and the police turned the Italians over to a mob at this time. This would be a good time to end this section and go to the other. This would make such a great movie. Angelo Massari. I begin the book, in fact, he writes his autobiography, and the first sentence of his book is he scribbles on a wooden gate of his home in Sicily. 13 Ottobre 1901. October 13th, 1901, he left for America. And he comes and he writes in his autobiography, when in 1902 I landed in Tampa, I found myself in a world of radicals for which I was prepared. And when I listened to speeches against the Catholic Church and the priesthood, I was not at all surprised. In those days in Tampa, anarchists and socialists were many. He becomes an international banker. He doesn't become an anarchist. He becomes a fabulously wealthy international banker. So the story is really complicated. It's the American dream, radical dreams that founder on rocks, dignity, work. I mean, there's a lot of swirling messages here. I may need some help. Would you go to the other PowerPoint, please? Yep. I'm going to switch, and I thought it would be interesting to see a side of Ybor City you often don't see. So it's looking at Ybor City, this critical 30-year period, which I didn't spend a lot of time in the book, but I'm far more interested now. So 1931 is critical. The La Lectura ends. People stopped smoking cigars during the Great Depression. They started smoking cigarettes, which are addictive, by the way. And the cigar manufacturers, what are we going to do? So everywhere, every place in the world, you need a scapegoat, right? It's not your fault. It's obviously the reader's fault or Jews' fault. I mean, there's always someone to blame. And they blame the reader for fomenting rebellion. And the readers, and your grandfather told me, we read what the workers wanted us to read. By the way, there was an election. The reading was democratically derived. You voted on which novel you wanted to read. And there's a famous story, movie-worthy again, of two Cubans arguing over a Victor Hugo novel. One thinking the language is a little coarse for the ladies. They took their argument outside and had a duel and killed one another over arguing about a book. They should have the statue in front of the library, seriously. But they ended the last reading. 1931 is also the Great Depression. The cigar industry will never recover. What happens is a beautiful alignment. Machines replace workers. Radios replace the reader. Oh, by the way, the story is about World War II. So I had my father in there. The Mormino knows. father's a fourth grade dropout, by the way, a fourth grade dropout. Isn't that great artwork? I mean, seriously, where do you get artwork? All these will be available with my warning. I don't have any, what do you call it, I have no permission slips, but your educators, if you didn't know where, Mauricio from, by the way. So, by the way, your president wants to talk to you about this. Seriously. That lurid headline, it's like National Guard. In 1938, the University of Tampa was really foundering. They had no endowment. And a German council by the name of Baron von Spiegel comes and said, we'd be interested in establishing an endowment so you can hire a German professor. And by the way, we think you should fire the German professor here, and who was Jewish, by the way. And Time magazine actually wrote about this, about the scandal at the University of Tampa over whether, they never fired the professor, by the way, so it ends happily. So you probably would keep your job. By the way, he became a U-boat captain in the war, a very celebrated U-boat captain. 1936. I don't ever remember, as an undergraduate, any discussion of the Spanish Civil War. By the way, everywhere, I mean, this summer for 7 weeks, you could not escape the Spanish Civil War in Valencia, which was the last Republican stronghold after Madrid fell. But for 2 years, I walked by this place and didn't pay any attention to it. And one day I looked closely, there were these Art Deco letters, and it said, Refugios. It was a bomb shelter, a refuge. And there's like dozens of them in Valencia, R-E-F-U-G-I-O-S. I think you can make an argument, no city in America was so caught up in the Spanish Civil War as Tampa. And no city certainly supported the Republican cause more. Very briefly, the rebels, curiously in this, are the fascists. The Francoistas there. The military had rebelled in 1936. The problem was the military, for good reason, had been placed in North Africa and the Canary Islands. That's where Franco was. How do you get the military to the mainland? And they went to Germany and Italy. And Germany and Italy, this became the first of the proxy wars. And the left wing went to the Soviet Union. And but every street seems to be a battleground in modern-day Spain. You've named it after a right-wing, brutal dictator or a lieutenant. We're facing, similar issues, although not in that scale here. What do you do with a segregationist and a neighbor? This seems trivial in comparison, but will give you an idea. You can't read the Tampa Tribune without escaping the Spanish Civil War. Here the thing is about the Spaniards here can no longer get saffron, Spanish olive oil, wine, etc. By the way, does that, speaking of that, does that look like an interesting group? What a great photograph. Spanish Civil War is the golden age of photograph. Frank Cappa is there. No Pasaran.
Could you go back for a second? Thank you. We want to.
Where was this?
Yeah, you're going to get a copy of this. But
Gary,
yes.
Kenya Dworkin's...
Your aunt.
No, Kenya Dworkin's doing some research in the special collection. She says she's found evidence that the Gonsmarts here in Tampa were big supporters of Franco.
Have you heard that? I've heard that, rumors, but I don't know if I've ever verified that.
Tampa was not exclusively a Republican center.
No.
We had some people that favored the military.
Most of the cigar manufacturers, I think, did support Franco, but not everyone there. One of the wildest interviews I ever had, I bet you knew Danny Alvarez.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The policeman?
Yes, the policeman. later bagman. But Danny Alvarez, he begins the interview. Talk about, I almost fainted when he said, my life changed in 1938, the day Franco won the Spanish Civil War. Or his family was very Republican. And his father came home from work rather agitated. And he said he gave each of his sons a hug, which he normally wouldn't do midday. Goes back to work. A boss at work had been hectoring him, and he shoots the boss and kills the boss and then commits suicide. But the story has an amazing backstory. He's essentially an orphan, and a druggist on Nebraska Avenue named Curtis Hickson likes this kid's pluck. And he eventually gets Danny Alvarez. He's one of the first Latin policemen in Tampa. And then Curtis Hickson becomes mayor. And he told me, I said, well, what did you do for Curtis Hickson? He said, I was his bagman. I would go around and collect hundreds of thousands of dollars from the gambling interest, which we haven't discussed. I assume, has anyone discussed Bolita?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Where was this picture taken?
When?
Where?
Spain. Probably Barcelona. Barcelona was the anarchist center at this time. I don't know if you heard, you know the phrase, the fifth column? Mm-hmm. You probably don't associate that with the Spanish Civil War. But they asked General Mola, who was besieging Madrid, they asked him, he had 4 tank columns headed for Madrid. And they asked him, which one will enter first? He said, the fifth column was already there. Meaning saboteurs,
The enemy within.
sympathies, the enemy, yeah. Look, that's from the Tampa Tribune, May of '37. By the way, lest you think, I mean, you typically, like the good guys and the bad guys, you know, the typical academic perspective, well, the good guys are the Republicans, the bad guys are. The Republicans, when they captured Ronda, took several hundred residents who were Franco supporters and threw them from the bridge several hundred feet below. Here's some clippings from the Tampa Tribune, Tampa Daily Times. By the way, notice the name here. Dan Compton. That's not exactly a Latino name. An Italian over here, Giuseppe Monaco, fears that if he's returned to Italy, which is now solidly fascist, I have no idea whatever happened to him. And it's not just financial support. Campaños, I don't know if you I don't think you were here about 3 months ago. They had a big discussion. What do you call someone from Tampa? Tampan has an ungainly thing. Campaño seems too Latin. Campanian seems too Roman. But here it's
That's where we get that a lot.
That has some so Spanish Civil War is over. World War II begins. Actually, that's the beginning. I find Ybor City in World War II. First of all, it's the neglected chapter. I'm working on a book on Florida in World War II. My family was deeply affected by World War II. All my uncles and that. And I interviewed a lot of people over this, and you get a very different perspective. It's a page is turned. Importantly, I think you could argue at the beginning of the war, if you asked most Spanish Americans, Italian Americans, Cuban Americans, do you really feel American? They would probably say yes, but we're also outsiders. People would plant high and would look down upon us. At the end of the war, I don't think anyone denied that we belong here. Beautiful example outside Tampa is a colleague of mine teaches at Vassar, and she wrote a book called G.I. Jews. Her father's in uniform on the cover. And she interviewed hundreds of Jewish Americans, and they all said, we felt searing anti-Semitism during the war as a soldier. But every one of them said, I felt 100% American. When the war ended, I'm as good as you are, and I'll kick your ass if you call me a bad word. So the war is a cauldron for Americans. Lots of Latin families have big families. That's the nature of immigrant life. Lots of eligible sons. Tampa's also changing. Medill Field, the imprint of the federal government, now with the New Deal, now with national security, preparedness for war. Some groups feel very vulnerable. Italy is now, one of the greatest stories ever. The mayor of Tampa was one of my students. Her name was Pam Iorio. I knew her father well, John Iorio. And John Iorio was born in Naples, family moves to Jersey, and he wants to join 101st Airborne after Pearl Harbor. And FBI agent knocks at the house and said, son, you're technically an enemy alien. We're at war with Italy. But given the fact that you moved at 1 month, when we talk to they talk to his priest, and he's like, he's a patriot, and they have the signing papers. And they asked him, John E. Oriole, we got one question before you sign this. John E. Oriole, would you be willing to bomb your hometown? And he said, why the hell would I want to bomb Trenton, New Jersey? And he becomes a hero and winds up at Columbia. He wanted to be a truck driver in 1941. At the end of the war, he's at Columbia. Pearl Harbor, you'll never see a banner headline like that. I mean, the printer at the St. Pete Times was saving red ink. He thought something big would happen. A personal story, you knew Hampton Dunn. Salty Saul Fleischman was a very famous sports journalist. He tells me this story. And December 7, 1941, he's at the Tampa Terrace Hotel. He's working there because he's Jewish. On Sunday, Kate Smith is singing, and suddenly we interrupt this program. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. He said, I'm a journalist, sports jock. I don't know what the hell's going on. So he goes down to get a sandwich, and who drives up in a Jeep but the commander of MacDill Army Airfield, this imposing man named Clarence Tinker, by the way, who's 1/8 Osage Indian. And he says to Saul, he hadn't heard the news yet, any news? And Saul said, well, I heard something about the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. And Tinker spits out his coffee and said, son, this means war. 6 months later, Clarence Tinker becomes the first general killed in World War II at Midway. And Salty Saul's in the Coast Guard. And the news is electric in Ybor City. Renee Gonzalez told me that his neighbor in Ybor City was a Sicilian woman who had sons in the war. And so she promised the Virgin Mary, if the sons came home, she would not take down the Christmas tree. So by the end of the war, there were no Legos. But she comes home when the sons are down. Her knees are bloody, going up for the pilgrimage of Santa Rosalia. Most people heard about on the radio, the Central Espanol Club. I mean, all the clubs immediately were saying, hey, we're foursquare in this war. We're buying war bonds. There's a book out. I've got an essay in the book on Ybor City by Maggie Rivas Rodriguez, who's a great scholar, University of Texas. She's done several books on this. That's her father, top right, being awarded the Purple Heart, I believe. This is sick, and I even hesitate to show students this, but it shows you how war has changed and how the war in the Pacific was so different. But the column here, Albert Bass, first local Marine to kill Jap, win Shaw Prize. The citizens of Quincy, Florida put up $25 for the first local boy to kill a Japanese soldier. By the way, we never did this with German soldiers. I mean, it's very interesting how the war in the Pacific was so different. Fuller Warren, who later became governor of Florida, very involved in Ybor politics. I find this letter, he's written almost every newspaper. would you read, I want to take part, I want to take an active part. He writes this to the Secretary of War.
I want to take an active part in subduing the Japs and Germans, hereby volunteer my services in whatever field or company that can best be useful in making corpses out of those brutal, bloodthirsty barbarians. I have no inclination to kill Italians, who would be considered craven cowards.
By the way, he becomes governor in 1948, governor of Florida. This is social dynamite, by the way. I'm at the Franklin Roosevelt Library, and an archivist comes and says, you won't believe what I just found. This is a 1942 George Gallup poll, stamped confidential for very good reasons. The idea of a poll like this today, oh my God, it's beyond the pale. They asked Americans, essentially the question was, other than your own group, how do you feel about the other people of the world? And then we're hitting at immigrants. So what do you think of the immigrants and the other people of the world? And there's a pecking order, as you might imagine. The top feeders, Canadians, English, Dutch, Scandinavians, Irish, interesting. So as historians and observer, what strikes you as interesting that the Irish are ranked toward the top? 100 years earlier, they were the most despised group in America. But there's a message in there of redemption, I think, that groups assimilate. John Kennedy is about to win a star of bravery in the war. His father is ambassador to the King of St. James. But look at go back. Germans. The Germans are ranked rather high. Jewish refugees in the middle. I mean, that's rather cold. Jewish refugees.
Below the Germans.
But look at the bottom feeders. There's no Poles, Russians, Chinese, Spaniards, Italians. Are you kidding me? Mexicans, Japanese. I mean, is that interesting and disturbing? But that was a national poll by George Gallup. Don't know anything about the context of it. It'd be interesting to write to Roosevelt Library. So in September 43, Italy boots Mussolini out and they declare independence. Rome is an open city. One of the interesting characters in Tampa I knew was this guy named Frank. In Italian it's Adamo, but everyone pronounces it Adamo. But he's given a choice in 1940. Do you want to go to Europe or the Philippines? He said, well, Europe is at war. That's probably not a good idea. Philippines seems safe, right? He's captured by the Germans, saves a lot of lives there, comes back as a hero. But in 1940,
captured by the Japanese.
Yeah, did I not?
Not the Germans.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. This is Angelo Perez's grandfather, or father rather, I guess, whose father is Cuban, Perez, his mother is Italian, and he promised, like any good Italian boy, he promised his mother, he's in Italy, what's he promised his mother he's going to do? I'll go to the village, and I'll say hello to your aunt and sisters who were there. And this happened a lot, bringing also food, which was desperately needed. More of that there. Braulio Alonso, one of the greatest men. I would rank him as one of the top 3 or 4 most decent men. I did an article on him about 15 years ago as Tampa's greatest living person. I said there are many people who are richer, more famous. No one has lived a life of quiet dignity and eloquence like Braulio Alonso. It's Tom Hanks, except he's Spanish American. All of his life, it's more like the movie It's a Wonderful Life. He had these dreams, I want to be a doctor and travel. But he doesn't go to the University of Florida to do pre-med because he's making too much money working at a bolita stand. And he's making more money than his father. But says, I'll go as a University of Tampa. He's a University of Tampa guy. He's a physics major, which probably the only physics major here in the 30s. And graduates, ready for med school, but he's drafted in 1941. The first peacetime draft in American history, but it's for 90 days, no big deal, right? Well, 90 days turned into 4 years. And June 5th, 1944, famous for what? Next day is D-Day. Rome falls June 5th. So what would you do if you were a GI in Rome? You're alive. Yeah, get drunk, look for women. I mean, instead, he's counter to my previous argument. He's a very pious man, and he orders a Jeep driver to take him to the Vatican. And he goes up to a Swiss guard and said, "I'd like to see Pope Pius XII, please." He said, get away. And he goes back to his Jeep, gets some cigarettes, candy, and nylons, returns, and the guy says, I misunderstood your question. And he said, wait right here. He has an audience with Pope Pius XII, who gave him a rosary, which he still had. He becomes a school teacher, not a doctor. He becomes a principal. There's a high school named after him in Tampa now. First Hispanic president, I think, of the National Teachers Association, fired during a Tampa teacher strike for taking the teacher's side. Died how many years ago?
Gary, I want to add.
Please. EJ knew him even better than I.
At the end of the audience with Pope Pius XII, he has just received the rosary, and these were the parting words of Pope Pius XII that Braulio never forgot. You are now the winners. Be compassionate.
How interesting. You'd want...
You have won the war. You are the winners now. Be compassionate.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. By the way, at the end of the war, he's in the Italian Dolomites. A German general comes to him with his baton. He won't accept it. He was so angry at the Germans for prolonging the war. He was commanding black troops at that time. He had the Germans surrender to his black troops. Now, what's interesting about that is I have colleagues who think that's insulting to black troops. You could look at that either way, I suppose. But what an interesting figure. The Villa brothers of West Tampa, all brothers in the war. If I could go back to a time machine, this is where I'd go. The Tampa shipyards. About 20 years ago, a colleague of mine worked at the Tampa Tribune named Steve Otto. His mother, I knew, worked at the shipyards. So Steve puts a piece in the paper. If you're a World War II vet of the Tampa shipyards and woman, please come to the USF library on a Saturday. And we were expecting 3 or 4 women. We had like 80 women showed up. They brought their union badges, their photographs. We did interviews. But you wonder what their dreams were. And it's an interesting field if you're in history, the impact of World War II on women. And there seem to be 2 competing lines. One is nothing was more revolutionary than earning a paycheck and establishing your own dignity for the first time. I always ask my students, so true or false, for the first time in American history, large numbers of women work for wages. And the answer is false, by the way. Immigrant women, black women, poor women had always worked for wages. The difference in World War II is married, white, middle-class women worked for wages in large numbers. The cities, I have 1,000 of these. The first woman blank. This is the first butcher, woman butcher, with the greatest name, Ines Pecorino. Now, tell me, that's not a Hollywood name. You didn't see a lot of women in butcher shops, but all the butchers are drafted. Mother breaks in tears. This is Consuelo Estevez getting a present from her son in the South Pacific. Now this is interesting. What happened? EJ, who would have been a hoodlum at this time in West Tampa, but West Tampa have no worries about zoot suit hoodlums. Now, do you all know the context of this? The zoot suit riots. EJ, you have a comment on this? I mean,
zoot suits were identified with the Puerto Ricans
Yes.
from New York.
And West Coast Mexican Americans.
Yes,
Right. And,
but we didn't have Puerto Ricans, and we didn't have Mexicans, so we didn't have Zoot Zoots in West Tampa.
this is a famous scene painted by Ferdy Pacheco. You all know Ferdy Pacheco? He was one of the more intriguing figures I have ever met. You know, the term Renaissance man is tossed out now if you can chew gum and talk. He really was a Renaissance man. As a teenager during World War II, now you have to put this in perspective, to be a waiter at the Columbia restaurant, you probably couldn't become a waiter until you were in your 40s. You worked as a busboy, you waited your turn, and if you were lucky, this is a fabulous job. All the waiters are drafted. His aunt Lola is a cashier at the Columbia. He gets a job as a teenager. So he has great insight. So this is the Columbia restaurant from Ferdy Pacheco's eyes in World War II. There's Ferdy there. And of course, he's best known as the fight doctor for Muhammad Ali, who he met as Cassius Clay in Liberty City in 1960.
And there was Martí. Did you all see Martí there?
More of the Spanish Civil War. Tommy Gomez, who almost no one remembers anymore, still alive?
No, I think he died.
Tommy Gomez challenged Joe Louis, and did he knock him down?
I think he did. But
He
then-
lost the fight, but he was a formidable heavyweight contender who got badly mauled at the Battle of the Bulge, I believe, and never really was the same after the injuries in World War II. Boxing, by the way, was huge in Ybor City and West Tampa. I mean, just and all the natural rivalries, a Cuban versus an American, black versus white. I mean, you had all these things. One of the greatest military heroes in Tampa history was in World War II. His name was Baldomero Lopez. His mother was Italian, but they selected him. They thought he had so much promise. They wanted him to go to West Point. Or was it Naval Academy?
Naval Academy.
Naval Academy. And he's one of the first Americans awarded a Medal of Honor at Incheon. He's killed at the invasion of Incheon in 1950. Peace comes at last. Now, these next two photographs are priceless. So how could you tell the difference? Everyone was celebrating World War II, VJ Day. Most delirious celebration in American history. So this is Ybor, no, well, that's the kiss. But this is St. Petersburg. So look at the faces and the complexions of St. Petersburg, kind of a white bread city in VJ Day, and then look at Ybor City. Can you tell the difference? St. Petersburg, Ybor City. You know, Frank Orso's mother, I believe, is in that photograph, the late Frank Orso.
And Tony Pizzo's
Dorms
nephew
you
is
stay
this
in.
young little boy, the second from the bottom.
Here,
He is now a prominent
surgeon?
dental surgeon.
Yes. No atheist in Foxhole. So I told you the story about many of the Latin women promised they would make an appeal to the Virgin Mary if their sons came back. And what's interesting is after World War II, I got a lot of really angry letters, phone calls. Elderly Cuban, Spanish, Italian women were saying, "Yeah, I just don't understand your hostility to the church." I'm trying to say I'm independent on this, but they say, you know, but I think often it's your sense of perspective. So after World War II, you had this mass migration of Latins out of Ybor City. Many went to West Tampa. Many just kind of assimilated into Tampa. Part of being an American after World War II was joining a church. So they only remember their grandmother as a church member, but most of that is probably after the war as part of kind of an Americanization. Many Catholic churches, for instance, to say Mass in Italian or Spanish, you had to have special designation. The church took a lot of those away after World War II. I was going to tell the A.P. Lato story about, well, the clubs. the clubs were at their zenith in 1945. Many of them kept in contact with the boys over there. They had fundraisers. I mean, everything seemed poised for an ideal future. And in 10 years later, they're all had fissures everywhere in Ybor City. The clubs are losing members. Many of the boys who went away didn't marry Latin girls. They met a nice Catholic girl at a USO dance in Missoula, Montana. Your new wife is probably not going to want to live in Ybor City. There literally hasn't been any new housing since the 1920s. West Tampa is a safety valve for many of these people. That neighborhood EJ lives in was mostly built in the 50s, 60s there. But many people got jobs where they now had insurance, health insurance, so they didn't need the clubs for insurance. Many of them probably just want, I want to be more American now. You know, the war's cauldron of that. But the clubs go into deep decline precisely at a moment when the immigrants are aging and need health insurance. So they now have financial problems. The clubs are getting old. They need repairs. So the clubs go into a deep decline. Centro Asturiano survived the best. Now, almost all the clubs, you don't need to join the Centro Asturiano in the beginning. You had to prove you were from Asturias, etc. No longer true on most of the clubs. Many of the clubs have movie theaters now because no one's interested in going to a Spanish language, Italian language play. One of the most intriguing characters out of this is I haven't spent much talking about black Cubans. I interviewed Francisco Rodriguez, first of all, who's one of the most articulate men I ever knew. And he was living in a dingy home. Here's a guy who had an incredible background. As may have been mentioned, he was also, am I right, EJ, he was disbarred?
He what?
Was he disbarred?
He was disbarred because he had failed to file proper income tax and then pled guilty to an IRS violation, and because it's a felony, the Florida bar disbars you.
Do you think race had anything to do with it or not?
Do what?
Did race play a role?
Oh, they were after him forever, because he was representing blacks that were charged with raping white women. He was, what's the famous Chief Justice, the black Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall. He was the Thurgood Marshall lawyer in Florida.
Marshall spent a lot of time in Florida voting rights. I have a story. I wouldn't tell a class. I'm even hesitant to tell you, but I'll try to get around this. So I'm interviewing him. He so articulate, you just can't imagine. His father was also a giant figure. He tells me he's a young, by the way, he's a Marine, a black Marine in World War II. The beginning of the war, there had never been a black Marine. They created the Black Marine Division later in the war. So not a lot of Afro-Cubans are advertised. They're Marine veterans. And he tells me he goes to Howard Law School, challenges a law that interstate segregation on trains. He said, you know, you can't, this is federal. I think he won the case. But he's telling me that he's a young lawyer in Tampa in the 1950s, and he enters a courtroom, and he describes a judge as a cracker judge. Was it Grayson?
L.A. Grayson.
Yeah. And the judge, there are 3 Mexican migrant laborers there, and the judge is berating them because they don't speak Spanish. Rodriguez goes up, hat in hand, well-dressed, and said, Your Honor, I'd be happy to translate for them. And at the end of the day, have you heard this story? No. Okay, all right, we know the story. It's, what an interesting character. I think, am I right, you nominated him for the Tampa Walk of Fame?
Yes.
And had difficulty getting him in, I believe, but a well-deserved honor. And here's Rodriguez being inducted. Here, how many of you know the author, Jose Iglesias? And by the way, note, there's no accent mark. Even though he was about as proud a Hispanic as ever lived, he did not think accents were a good idea. so he never accented his name. An amazing story. Also one of the most handsome men you would ever know. He's also a World War II vet. Tells this story that he's in New York City with 3 other Navy guys, I think, and they're all going to Tampa. And the bus driver, or the cab driver said, "Man, be careful in Ybor City. The Spics are very dangerous there." And so, as a gentleman, he doesn't say anything to the cab driver. But after the war, he goes to Black Mountain College. Does that name ring a bell with anyone? Black Mountain is about as radical a place in 1946 as any place in America. I actually spent a lot of time in Black Mountain. It's also a very conservative place these days. But at any rate, it's a place of experiment. There are no formal classes, but there are future Nobel Prize winners there. It's also integrated. This is North Carolina post-World War II. And he decides he wants to be a writer. And he made I did an article of him in the Tribune, said, the greatest writer, Tampa writer no one knows. I bet you could ask 100 Tampanos, not one person could identify him. He's just not well known. The book I would recommend, I think is to Penny's point, is The Goodbye Letter. It's about Galicia and his ancestors there. You think about it, everyone was always saying goodbye. It was the place of immigration, EMI, immigration. I tell a story in the book about a strike in West Tampa, and I believe that's his uncle. Do you remember his name? He was the mayor of West Tampa. Milian. And he's kidnapped. He's a reader and the mayor of West Tampa, kidnapped by vigilantes, taken to Cuba, and said, if you return and resume your activities, you will be killed. Defiantly, he returns. Heroes welcome. And that's how we met, is he was reading my book and saw that. And by the way, just the consummate gentleman there. One of the more noble characters in Ybor City was a man named Victoriano Mantega. I interviewed him. He was very old. He was hunchbacked at the time. Was born in Cuba, comes to Tampa about 1918 as a reader in the cigar factory, and begins a newspaper called La Gaceta. And one of 3 or 4 newspapers, there was a newspaper called La Traducción, which was the readers' translations of American newspapers in the day. I hope we find a lot of these papers later, but I'm kind of giving up hope they're in attics and things like that. But Mantega was a fierce advocate of the underdog. All of his life he was writing about this, except even he has a blind spot. I have a quote of his in 1954. What's happening in Ybor City after World War II? By the way, his son is a hero in the Philippines in World War II, who takes over the paper. But in 1950, a lot of African Americans had moved to Ybor City. There's a white migration out, and he writes a long piece on Ybor City and the challenge African Americans there. His son, the guy on the left, Roland, a kind of playboy, gadfly, but also one of the more decent men you've ever known. So I was at his funeral. What does it tell you that his funeral pallbearers, 2 of the pallbearers, one of the pallbearers was the governor of Florida, and the other pallbearer was the man who created all these strip joints, girly joints in Tampa. It tells you something about Roland Mantega had a very wide web in his life. One of the greatest dinners I ever had in my life, my wife and I went to dinner. Roland was there. Bobby El Loco Rodriguez, the founder of the original strip clubs in Tampa, and Ferdy Pacheco were there. Oh my God, the stories. Roland is also in bronze, by the way. You probably saw him. But it was a tradition, if you were running for office, you were supposed to get Roland's endorsement. Challenges ahead. We barely mentioned Bolita. And this is related to a larger question, I think. To me, the question you have to ask about post-war Tampa, why in the world would Tampa allow Ybor City to be gutted in the 1960s? In hindsight, this just makes no sense because they did nothing with the land. It just seemed almost a cruel measure. And one of the reasons is Ybor City had embarrassed Tampa for some time with Bolita, this kind of private enterprise game. The best Bolita story I ever heard. Now, I think I've got his picture next. Let's see. Oh, did you know Phil Lo Cicero? In Italian, it's even better. Lo Cicero. So Phil Lo Cicero tells me the story. By the way, he had two of the most amazing moments in history. He's going to come later. He had lunch with an interesting character. But Phil tells me the best Bolita story. So many Latins believe you bet your dream. So a guy, the bolletero comes, you bet a number from 1 to 100. Most people, you need a reason to bet 15. So there was a book called La China Chorada, the Chinese dream book. You bet your dream. So Phil's father, Sicilian immigrant, wakes up one morning and says, oh my God, I had the most vivid dream of a serpent. And he consults the dream book, I think it's number 13, and he's going to bet $5 rather than a nickel. And his wife is screaming at him, that money was for a down payment of her house. What kind of role model are you in front of young Felipe? No, the dream was real. He bets $5. Number 13 comes up, except what? The bolletero has fled to Cuba. There's no one to pay him. And so he comes home, says, dress Felipe up, I'm going to the police department. I came to America because it was a land of justice, and I've got my receipt. And he goes to the police department, and I always ask my students, so what happens? Tell me what you think happens. How many of you think he's arrested and Felipe is scarred for life? How many of you think they paid him off? They paid him every penny. EJ, would you explain why?
Well, the cops were in on it.
Exactly. You can't have illegal gambling on this level without bribes taken. And the worst thing you could have if you're operating a betting game is the rumor, Lo Cicero won the lottery, but no, they wouldn't pay him off. It's a fraud. Now, the guy who's in serious trouble is the bolletero. He's messed the system up. But this tells you something about Tampa politics and corruption. And getting back to why Ybor City. So no one's done a good book on this, by the way. That's the next book, is on urban renewal. You're the man. After your book on Cubans. In 1950, Estes Kefauver, U.S. Senator from Tennessee, needs an issue to run for president. And he says, organized crime. Who's not against organized crime? And live television nationwide, those Americans who had TVs by then, they televised these, and they came to Tampa and Miami as well. The sheriff of Hillsborough County, Culbreth, the Latins always called La Cabeza de Melon because of his bald head. They asked the sheriff of Hillsborough County, so we find it interesting that you were making $4,000 a year for all these years and you have like $100,000 in a bank account. How do you explain this? He said, my wife is a very good manager of our household income. And never went to jail, by the way. But the more important point, Tampa is embarrassed. The good news is a whole new generation of young leaders emerges, mostly World War II vets. Sam Gibbons, not just a World War II vet, he parachuted into Normandy June 5th, 1944. He will become a congressman. Tony Pizzo, Hampton Dunn, all these people, they want a better Tampa. And that's not necessarily a worse Ybor City, but that's going to be one one of the outcomes is a little more purity in Tampa. It's also the Red Scare era, the McCarthy era, and the Florida U.S. Senator Claude Pepper is indicted in one of the more scurrilous smear campaigns. And this book is produced, The Red Record of Senator Claude Pepper. He's not just defeated in 1950, he's destroyed by a young Marine, good-looking guy, University of Florida graduate, whose name escapes me? George Mathers. So the fact that Tampa had always also leaned left is not going to help Tampa in this situation. In 1955, let's get back to Phil. So remember the conversation at the Italian club, Joe Maniscalco, early November 1955. He's reading to the board upcoming events. So the Italian Women's Club is going to be having a fashion show. And he says, and this lawyer from Cuba, Fidel Castro, wants to give a talk at the Italian club next week. And Maniscalco jumps up and says, no, we can't have him here. I don't know whether Maniscalco really knew that Fidel was a communist. I don't think in 1955 Fidel was a communist. But Maniscalco had a fruit and vegetable plantation in Cuba and knew this is one of the greater ifs in history. So think about this. The previous year, Fidel and his brother had attacked a Cuban military base at Moncada, killed several Cuban soldiers. So if you were a brutal dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, what would you do with Fidel and his brother? I mean, that's a dumb question. Of course they're going to be hanged or shot. One of Fidel's professors from high school, this Jesuit high school, a priest, not a professor, appeals, they're good boys. And that's how Fidel and Raul escaped. And the first place they came after New York City was Tampa, Florida, to raise money for the revolution. And Maniscalco has lunch with Fidel at Los Novedades restaurant. He says a 4-hour lunch. Fidel has like 20 cafes con leche. Never once took a bathroom break. And finally, he said, the 40th time they said, no, you can't. Fidel looked very sulky. Out of movies, this is Maniscalco's story. He felt sorry for him. He gives him a cigarette lighter with Maniscalco fruits and vegetables, Cuban. Walks away. Fidel gives his speech, but at the CIO club in Tampa. You probably went not far from there. It's today's Martín Maceo Society. And that's Victoriano Manteiga on the right, who was the president of the, is it 27th of July Club? 26th of July Club. He was the local president. You know the other two people on the left?
No.
I don't know them either. But you notice the wads of bills. By the way, his first words talk about historical residents. His first words will be para Cuba que sufre la primera palabra, which is also going to be the first words when he takes over in '58, which of course were Jose Marti's words at the Liceo Cubano. I mean, history matters, the residents there. I felt terrible. So I did an article in the Tampa Tribune about 12 years ago on this, and we found this picture. This picture had been lost. Unbeknownst to me, that week, I think the Congress was voting to rename the post office the Victoriano Manteiga Post Office. And they came back and said, he's hanging around with Fidel Castro. So I think that's the reason, at least that's what Patrick has told me.
Where was this?
This was at the CIO Hall. That's on 7th. It was
it's Martín Maceo, right?
The CIO was a union. It was a left-leaning union that merged with the AFL, Congress and Industrial Organizations. It was always the most left-leaning union.
Sorry, is Martín Maceo in a new place now, or because Martín Maceo predated?
Oh yeah. That wasn't it's today's
So
Martini,
it was the
but
CIO
not in
hall-
1955.
The building with the CIO hall at the time.
Yes,
and now it's
exactly,
Martini
exactly,
Hall.
yes. And as you heard, I think the Martina said they were the only group to lose their clubhouse during urban renewal. Did you know Charlie at all, Arnatti?
I know him well.
The most bizarre character I have ever met. I hope you all have colleagues like this. Did you know him at all?
We just didn't walk around campus.
So Charlie, the first time I met Charlie, I knock at his door, he opens the door, he's stark nude. And I didn't know he took a nap every day at noon on a little ride. Well, hi, Charlie. So Charlie Arnett, first of all, I'll try to make this brief. It's such a good story. You can't make his life story up. He's born in Germany. The name Arnatti, does it strike you as an ethnic name? But his father was not German. He was a German military officer for the Third Reich. And in 1935, sensing correctly bad war clouds ahead, he takes his family, including Charlie, and moves to Nanking, China, where he trains troops for Chiang Kai-shek, Charlie's father, a general. Charlie was the last living English speaker who remembered the rape of Nanking, where 100,000 Chinese were killed by Japanese soldiers. So they're forced out of China back to Germany. Everything seems fine until a knock on the door and a friend says, you got to leave. They discovered a Jew in the family tree. And the Arnattis drive toward the Swiss border. Unlike the movie Sound of Music, they do make it, but the Swiss say, you've got 24 hours to leave. We don't want troublemakers here. And the Quakers accept the Arnattis and said, you're going to Bolivia. So I mean, here's someone who speaks a little Chinese, German, Yiddish, and now they're in Bolivia. Charlie became the most acclaimed Bolivian historian, or historian of Bolivia. Entered the University of Michigan not speaking a word of English, graduates, just an amazing character. But so he's teaching at the University of Tampa in 1955, and a student says, there's this crazy guy in the diner, and he goes over, it's Fidel Castro. So he has a cup of coffee with Fidel Castro. Later, and I believe this, I really do, later he's in La Paz, and a bartender says, there's this crazy guy at the end of the bar that says, he'll buy you a beer if you'll talk to him. And the guy says, I'm Che Guevara. So, believe it or not, if you believe half of it, it's a good story. Died about 10 years ago. Lived in San Antonio, Florida. I mentioned Tony Pizzo, he's in bronze. Nick Nuccio is another character in this. He becomes the first Latin mayor of Tampa, which was considered almost unthinkable prior to this time. He is a politician's politician. The most gregarious man you'd ever know. Each morning, he would go to Los Cuervos restaurant at 6 in the morning. If you wanted to meet the mayor, you just pulled up a chair. He was there like for 2 hours. He never once, he told me, went out with business associates for lunch. His wife, Conchetta, always had a pot of spaghetti boiling. What an interesting, was twice elected mayor, twice defeated. But probably the last time, he may be the last living person who has a statue, he's clutching a cigar, which is very politically incorrect now. And cigars are very passé. When I interviewed him, he would put on a suit, and it was so sad. The suit had like moths eaten away, but he still felt a bitterness toward the Tampa Tribune, who smeared him as a machine politician. He was a people's politician. He was pretty amazing.
He had to move from his home because he couldn't pay the taxes on the home, and he bought a little home in West Tampa.
And that's where I interviewed him. And I'm telling you, people told me if he took money, he was hiding it. somewhere because this was a modest house, to say the least. Speaking of modest homes, this is another amazing story in Tampa. You know the story about the Pedrosa family. So in 1955, Fulgencio Batista buys that property. He's going to create a Spanish-American museum. And I've heard stories, I don't know if it's true, Cuban tourists coming and taking a splinter out, like it was the splinter of the True Cross, you know, connected to Marti. And what happened is before they converted it to a museum, the termites had literally eaten away the structure and it just collapsed. So they built the Jose Marti Park there. So in 1993, October, I'm leading the tour. It's the 100th anniversary of Marti's first visit to Tampa, and we have 3 professors from the University of Havana. We get to the park, and there's a lock on there. I look, the lock, there's a message. The park is closed to communists. Okay. I look across the street, and there's like some really mean-looking guy. I think, oh my God, we're going to have an international incident. And my colleague, Luis Perez, who's probably the greatest Cuban scholar today, he takes his wife, he said, let's get away from here. And his wife and teenage daughter go into a little cafe inside the old cigar factory. And the daughter's wearing a t-shirt that says, just say no to racism. Not exactly a volatile. The woman wouldn't, she said, I don't sell soda to communists. Lou's wife leaps over the bar and they start brawling. And they think, oh my God, this is just going to end. You were there.
No. Kenny's also has another story about the fate of his
Well,
father.
no, I mean, so in the USS Special Collections, I found a reference to the fact that this Batista offered in '56, so a year after Fidel's visit here, offered to renovate the home to make it into a shrine, but it was burned down before that could be accomplished. And so that, to me, suggested something else going on to prevent Batista having a foothold, and yet, in the course of it, a historic building and a memory of people who participated in the struggle is erased. I'm curious, though, about why this building is the picture. It's different than the boarding home pictures that we always see in reference to Paulina and Ruperto Pedroso.
It could well be that my source is, because I got this online and I put home, and so I don't know. I suspect you're right. I'll trust your judge on that. Send me a photograph of the building. I'd like to use that. But,
well, I don't have a particular photograph, just the photograph that always appears in all the histories we've been reading of the boarding house where Marti stayed is a boarding house.
Yeah, it could be a
It has multiple.
I just don't know, but the message, though, the more important message is well, there are a lot of multiple truths. I mean, the myth and reality collide in Ybor City probably more often than any other place. I was the one who nominated her to get in the Florida Women's Hall of Fame. She's Ruperta Pedrosa, or Paulina rather, is in the Florida Women's Hall of Fame. This is the Marti Park. How many we ever conclude how many statues of Marti in Ybor City? Between statues and...
I think we have 1 statue of Marti and 3 busts of Marti and about 10 historical markers referring to Marti.
Interesting. Throughway pushing through part of Ybor City. Maybe as bad as the urban renewal was the idea. So where do you place interstate highways? What a coincidence. 2 interstate highways in Tampa. One goes through West Tampa and the other goes through Ybor City. What a coincidence. They're vulnerable. They don't go through middle-class neighborhoods, certainly. This was also true in the community I studied in St. Louis. They sliced through. It took the Little Italy in Chicago. In Boston, the Little Italy came down. this is a very common occurrence. People have written a lot about interstate highways and victims of interstate highways there. Big expressways will change the way of life in Tampa.
No.
That's 1961. This is, so beginning in I think, 63, 64, they decide this giant urban renewal project in Ybor City. The promise, you have to think about this, by the way. In 1961, why wouldn't you trust the government? This is a government that had just finished World War II. I mean, people weren't as nearly as cynical. And the idea whether they're going to build new housing, the Ybor City desperately needed new housing. By the way, it's not you've got black hats and white hats. Latin businessmen were eager to sell their property. It's a complicated. Nick Nuccio was involved with this partly as well. It's not black and white. It's complicated. People genuinely thought, but no one really thought this through, the implications of urban renewal. Ybor City still lives. It's maybe the last one. The obits. One of my odd loves, I love to read obituaries. I have students, the first day of class down, write their first sentence of their obituary. Now, presumably you're 90 years old. That's kind of fun to see what their dreams are. How are we doing time-wise?
We should end up, because especially we're not going to make it to the cafeteria with the downpour that's coming.
I'm available for questions or denunciations. Yes.
One question about all the interviews that you did. You said you did about 190 interviews with people in Ybor City. Are those donated to an archive?
Yeah, all the interviews are available at USF. Most of them are transcribed. Also, the University of Florida. I don't think there are 190 of them. See, a lot of at the end I was just taking notes as well, but there's probably 90 of them, I bet, that have been transcribed.
Thank you.
So, Gary, we'd like for you to join us over in the
Certainly.
cafeteria, and so if people have questions and want to continue this discussion, we can do it at the cafeteria.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Gary.